Deborah Powell had been a fixture in the Hampton Heights community for over 40 years. At 72, she was known as a kind, dignified woman who had spent her life teaching history to high school students. Her Victorian home in the Heritage District stood proudly as one of the last remaining original properties, a testament to the neighborhood's deep history. It was more than just a home to Deborah. It was a symbol of everything she and her late husband, Robert, had built together, a legacy that was now under threat. Across town, Charles Caldwell, the wealthiest man in the county, had been buying up properties in the Heritage District for years, pushing people out with offers too good to refuse. Most had sold, but Deborah had refused to part with the house that held so many memories. Caldwell, known for his aggressive tactics, had even threatened some residents with illegal fines and shutoffs. But Deborah held firm. She had no intention of selling, no matter how many millions Caldwell threw at her. This evening, Deborah was attending the opening of a new art exhibit at the local gallery, a space where her former student, James Turner, was showcasing his latest works. James had always been a bright student in Deborah's class, and now he was a promising young artist in the town's growing art scene. Deborah was proud of him, and she couldn't miss this important moment in his career. The gallery was alive with chatter, the air thick with the scent of champagne and the clinking of glasses. Deborah moved through the crowd with quiet grace, exchanging polite nods with old acquaintances. She was content, but there was an underlying tension in the air that she couldn't quite place. As she wandered deeper into the gallery, she felt a sharp gaze on her, one that sent a chill down her spine. She turned slightly and saw Charles Caldwell standing near the entrance. He was dressed in a tailored suit that screamed power and wealth, his steely gaze locked onto her. Deborah had always known him to be an ambitious man, but something about the way he looked at her now felt different, more calculating. "I assume you know who that is?" a voice asked beside him. Deborah didn't have to look to know who it was. It was Victor Preston, the gallery owner, and Caldwell's right-hand man. "Of course," Caldwell responded coolly, eyeing Deborah with thinly veiled contempt. "Deborah Powell, she's the last piece we need. Once her house is gone, we can finish our development plan for the Heritage District. She's stubborn, but eventually she'll break. If not, we'll make her." Preston nodded, clearly understanding Caldwell's intentions. "Do you think it will work?" he asked. "Absolutely," Caldwell said with a tight smile. "Once the community turns on her, once the media does its job, she won't have a choice but to sell. Everyone will turn against her. She'll have no way out." Deborah overheard just enough of their conversation to understand that something was afoot. But what could she do? She was just a teacher, a woman in her golden years. What threat could she possibly pose to a man like Charles Caldwell? Before she could dwell too much on this, Preston raised his voice to announce, "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that the Callaway diamond necklace, which was on loan for tonight's charity auction, has gone missing." A ripple of surprise spread through the gallery. The Callaway diamond necklace was worth more than $1 million, and its absence would surely cause a scandal. Deborah frowned, her mind racing. She had passed the display case only moments ago, and nothing seemed out of place. But now, with the room buzzing with tension, something felt off. James leaned in, his voice low. "This is strange. That necklace was under tight security. There's no way it could have been stolen without someone noticing." "I agree," Deborah replied, her instincts telling her that something wasn't right. Her gaze flicked toward the corner of the room, where Caldwell and Preston were speaking quietly. The unease in Deborah's gut deepened. She didn't trust either of them. Within minutes, 2 police officers arrived, Officer Greg Dawson, a tall, muscular man with a permanent scowl, and Officer Brian Harris, who seemed nervous and twitchy. They moved straight toward Deborah, their presence unnerving her. "Excuse me, ma'am," Dawson said loudly, his voice carrying through the gallery. "We need to speak with you." Deborah's brow furrowed as she stood taller. "Of course, officers. What's this about?" "We've received a report that you were seen near the display case before the necklace went missing," Harris said, his eyes flicking between her and the other gallery guests. Deborah felt a pang of confusion. "I was just talking to James here. I arrived not long ago, and I haven't gone near that display case." Preston's voice rang out across the room. "I saw her near the case," he declared, his tone carrying an air of authority. Deborah's heart sank. She hadn't been near the case, but now she could feel the eyes of the crowd turning toward her. Her reputation, built over decades of hard work, was already starting to crumble. "I'm sure the security cameras will show exactly where I was," Deborah said, trying to keep her composure. Preston's face tightened. "Unfortunately, the cameras experienced a technical malfunction tonight. They were down for about 20 minutes, right when the theft occurred." Deborah's breath caught in her throat. It was all starting to make sense. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a setup. Before she could protest further, Dawson and Harris moved closer. Their hands hovered near their holsters. "Ma'am, if you refuse to cooperate, we'll have to take you down to the station." "I've done nothing wrong," Deborah replied firmly, her voice unwavering. "You cannot search my belongings without a warrant." The officers exchanged a look, then nodded. "You're under arrest for suspicion of grand theft and obstruction of justice." As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Deborah's world seemed to tilt. She had done nothing wrong, but here she was, being dragged out of the gallery in front of the very people who had once respected her. Whispers filled the room, and as the officers led her outside, she could hear the cruel murmurs of the crowd. Some were already recording the scene on their phones. Deborah held her head high, refusing to show any fear. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Master Sergeant Elijah Powell had seen more than his share of combat. He had served as a Green Beret for over 20 years, earning medals and accolades, but nothing could have prepared him for the call he received that night. He had just finished briefing his team on a new mission when his secure line rang. The number on the screen was familiar. It was his mother. The steady voice on the other end, though calm, was filled with an undercurrent of distress. "Elijah, I need you," Deborah said, her voice tight with anxiety. Elijah felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had always known his mother was tough, resilient in the face of adversity, but hearing that urgency in her voice was a warning he couldn't ignore. "What's wrong, Mom?" he asked, his heart already racing. "I've been arrested, son. They say I stole something. I've done nothing wrong, Elijah, but they're framing me. They're coming for my house." Elijah's grip tightened on the phone. Caldwell. He had heard the rumors about Caldwell's development plans for the Heritage District, and now hearing his mother's voice crack with frustration and fear, he knew exactly what was happening. Caldwell had been trying to buy Deborah's property for years, and she had refused every offer. He had always been a man who got what he wanted, no matter the cost. "Stay calm, Mom," Elijah said, his voice steady. "I'm on my way. I'll fix this." The line went quiet for a moment before Deborah responded. "I'm not afraid, but I need you. You need to come back. They've gone too far this time." Elijah's mind was already racing as he spoke to his commanding officer. With his superior's permission, he gathered a small team: Marcus Taylor, an expert in digital warfare, and David Wilson, a former military lawyer turned special forces operator. Together, they had helped him in countless operations over the years, and now they would help him dismantle the web of corruption surrounding his mother's case. As Elijah boarded the plane, his mind was sharp. He knew that this was no ordinary mission. It wasn't just about tactics and strategy. It was about dismantling a corrupt system that had wronged his family. He couldn't fail. His mother had raised him to stand for what was right, no matter the cost. Now it was time for him to show the world that the system that had framed her would be held accountable. Elijah's flight was smooth, but his thoughts were far from calm. As the plane cut through the sky, he couldn't help but think of the injustice Deborah had suffered. A lifetime of teaching, of giving back to the community, and now at the age of 72, she was being accused of a crime she hadn't committed. Caldwell's development project had already driven out so many of their neighbors, people who had lived in the Heritage District for generations. Some had sold out under pressure, others had simply been worn down by the constant barrage of intimidation. But Deborah, like the stone in a stream, had refused to budge. When the plane touched down in Westwood, Elijah's mind was focused. His team was ready. The moment he set foot on the tarmac, he received a text from Marcus. "We've got what we need. Time to take them down." The city was quiet at this hour, but Elijah knew the storm was coming. He was the storm. Deborah sat alone in the interrogation room of the Westwood police station, her wrists still raw from the handcuffs. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the walls. She had been here for hours, and yet no one had questioned her. It felt like a slow torture, an attempt to break her spirit, but she refused to bend. She had seen too much in her life to crumble now. She stared at the door, knowing that whatever happened next, she would not back down. She would not be silenced. Outside the room, officers shuffled past, muttering under their breath. Officer Greg Dawson and Officer Brian Harris had been the ones to arrest her, and she could feel their eyes on her as they spoke in hushed tones with Sergeant Miller, a heavy-set man who had been a fixture in the station for years. "She's not saying anything." Dawson's voice was low, but Deborah could hear it clearly. "Nothing we can use against her. The security footage is gone, and Preston's testimony is shaky." "She's not talking because she knows she's guilty," Miller replied, his voice tinged with cynicism. "She's not guilty," Harris muttered under his breath. "But you're right. She's not making this easy. She's got an iron will." Elijah would be here soon. Deborah knew it. He had always come when she needed him, and this time would be no different. She could hear his voice in her head. "I'll fix this, Mom. Just stay calm." Back at his team's operations center, Elijah, Marcus, and David were already working behind the scenes. Marcus, the digital expert, had begun to piece together the connections between Caldwell's empire and the local government officials who were aiding him. David was digging into the legal angle. He knew the local judges, and he knew how to work the system. Together, they were a force that no one could stop. David looked up from his tablet. "Caldwell is everywhere. His money has seeped into every corner of this town. But we found something interesting." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "What's that?" David slid a file across the table. "It's the connections between Caldwell and some of the local judges, including Judge Howard Whitmore, the man who will be handling your mom's case." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Whitmore's the one." "I think so. He's been getting campaign contributions from Caldwell for years," David said, his voice low. "This goes higher than just the police. This is systemic." Elijah's eyes flicked to Marcus, who was typing furiously on his laptop. "What do we have on the police?" Marcus glanced up. "Crow and Harris are dirty too. They've been taking bribes to target specific residents. They're bought and paid for." Elijah nodded grimly. "Then it's time to flip the script. Let's go get my mother." As Elijah and his team drove toward the police station, he knew the battle was just beginning. But this time, the system wouldn't win. This time, it would be justice that prevailed. By the time Elijah arrived at the Westwood police station, he was already mentally preparing for a fight. His mother, Deborah, had been detained for hours without any formal questioning, and he knew this was all part of the strategy to wear her down. He would not let her face this battle alone. As the black SUV pulled up in front of the station, the tension in the air was palpable. Elijah was calm, but his resolve was ironclad. As they exited the vehicle, Marcus and David flanked him, their expressions serious. There was no time for distractions. Elijah knew that the longer Deborah remained in custody, the more dangerous the situation became. The station was crowded with officers, many of them glancing nervously toward the entrance as the team walked through the doors. They recognized Elijah immediately. His reputation preceded him. The air shifted in the room, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Elijah's eyes locked onto Officer Dawson, the man who had led the arrest. Dawson's posture stiffened as Elijah's gaze bore into him, unblinking. Dawson knew better than to challenge the Green Beret. Elijah's presence alone was enough to rattle him. "Where is she?" Elijah asked, his voice low and controlled. "Who are you looking for, Sergeant Powell?" Dawson replied, his attempt to sound casual failing. "My mother. Where is Deborah Powell?" Dawson hesitated, glancing around at the officers near him. Before he could respond, Chief Henderson emerged from his office, his face drawn with stress. He had been briefed about Elijah's arrival, and the look of discomfort was evident in his eyes. "Elijah Powell," Chief Henderson said, extending his hand with a forced smile. "We've been expecting you." Elijah didn't take the offered hand. Instead, he stepped forward, his expression unwavering. "Where's my mother, Chief?" Henderson's shoulders slumped slightly. He'd been in charge for years, but the pressure was mounting. "She's in holding," he said, his voice low. "We've been waiting for the charges to be processed." Elijah didn't buy it. "There are no charges," he countered. "She's been falsely accused. and I intend to make sure everyone knows it." Henderson looked around the room, then nodded reluctantly. "Follow me, I'll take you to her." As they walked through the station, Elijah's team stayed close, ready for whatever came next. Every officer they passed seemed to shrink back slightly. They all knew who Elijah Powell was, and they all knew what kind of force he could bring to bear. The holding cell was at the back of the station, a stark, sterile room with dim fluorescent lighting. Deborah sat alone on a bench, her head slightly bowed, but her posture was still strong. She had spent decades facing challenges far greater than this, and her eyes, though tired, still held the same fire. When she saw her son, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Elijah," she whispered, standing slowly. "You came." "I promised, Mom," Elijah said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll always come." He walked toward her, taking her hands in his. She was cold from the cement bench, but she didn't seem to mind. She had been through far worse. "Are you okay?" Elijah asked, searching her face. Deborah nodded, but her eyes darkened. "They're trying to break me, Elijah. I haven't done anything wrong, but they've already started spreading rumors, false stories. They want me out of this neighborhood. They want me to sell. It's all about my land, Elijah. Caldwell is behind this." Elijah's jaw tightened at the mention of Caldwell's name. He had known for years that Caldwell was ruthless, but now it was personal. His mother, the woman who had taught him every lesson in honor and strength, was being targeted because of a piece of land she refused to sell. "We'll fix this," Elijah promised, squeezing her hands gently. "We have the evidence. This is just the beginning." As they spoke, David and Marcus were already in motion, gathering everything they needed to turn the tide. David was busy contacting key legal allies, making sure they had every piece of the puzzle. Meanwhile, Marcus was hacking into the system, pulling records, and connecting the dots between Caldwell, the local police, and the corrupt officials who had been aiding him. Elijah looked over his shoulder, noting the tension in the room. The officers who had been part of the setup were now beginning to realize they were in over their heads. Dawson, who had arrested Deborah earlier, stood off to the side, his eyes avoiding Elijah's gaze. Officer Harris was nowhere to be seen, likely in a holding room somewhere, waiting for his fate to unfold. "Mom," Elijah said quietly, "I need you to stay calm. We have everything we need to take down Caldwell and everyone who helped him." Deborah looked at him, her eyes steady. "I'm not afraid, Elijah, but I won't let them erase our history. These homes mean something. They're not just buildings. They're our legacy." Elijah nodded, his respect for his mother growing with every word. She had always been the one to fight for what was right, and now he would fight by her side. Across town at Caldwell's sprawling mansion, the situation was unfolding differently. Caldwell had been monitoring the situation closely, and his frustration was mounting. He had expected things to go smoothly. He had expected Deborah to cave under pressure, like everyone else. But now, with Elijah back in town, he knew that his plan was in jeopardy. In his opulent office, Caldwell stood by the window, staring out at the city. He had built an empire, and he wouldn't let some elderly woman and her military son stand in the way of his vision. He was ruthless, yes, but he had always gotten what he wanted. This time, however, he was dealing with someone who wouldn't be intimidated. As he paced the room, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Victor Preston. "The situation is escalating. Powell is here. The media is picking up the story. We need to act fast." Caldwell paused, his fingers tapping restlessly on the glass. "I know what I need to do." He wasn't going to let this go. He never did. Back at the station, Elijah was not about to let Caldwell and his cronies win. The wheels were already in motion, and the tide was turning in their favor. With the evidence piling up and Caldwell's empire beginning to crumble, the battle for Deborah's freedom was far from over. But Elijah was ready, and this time, the truth would be his weapon. The tension in the Westwood police station was palpable. Elijah had promised his mother that he would fix this, and now more than ever, he was ready to stand up to the system that had wronged her. He didn't just want to clear her name. He wanted to take down the corrupt empire that had manipulated the town, and at the heart of it, Charles Caldwell. In the small, dimly lit room, Elijah sat across from Deborah, the weight of the fight ahead of them settling in. Though his mother was calm, her sharp gaze never wavered. Elijah could tell she was exhausted. She had been through so much, but she wasn't going to break, and neither would he. Elijah stood and paced for a moment, trying to organize his thoughts. Marcus and David had been working tirelessly behind the scenes. They had already gathered key evidence: emails, financial transactions, and testimony from former residents of the Heritage District who had been harassed into selling their homes. But it wasn't enough. They needed more. "We need to hit Caldwell where it hurts," Elijah muttered under his breath. "And I think I know how to do it." David, who had been listening closely, nodded. "We've got leverage now. Preston, Whitmore, and those officers, they're all involved. But Caldwell is the key. If we can tie him directly to the pressure on your mom, we'll have him. But we need to move quickly." Elijah stopped pacing and turned to David. "What do you need?" David's eyes were intense, his mind already calculating the next steps. "We need to get the right people to speak up, the ones who've been silenced, scared to testify. We need them to come forward. And we need more proof that Caldwell's hands are all over this. I've already got a few calls into some of the local lawyers who've been handling cases against him. They've been too scared to do anything, but with the right push..." "Then let's push," Elijah said, his voice unwavering. As the hours passed, the atmosphere in the police station grew more tense. Word had spread that Elijah Powell was back in town, and the corrupt officials who had been working with Caldwell were starting to feel the heat. Officers who had once stood by Caldwell's side were beginning to hesitate, unsure of the lengths they were willing to go to protect a man whose empire was crumbling. Deborah, despite the mounting pressure, maintained her composure. She knew that this was just the beginning. Caldwell had underestimated her, and he had underestimated her son. He had thought that he could break her with lies, with false accusations, but she wouldn't back down, and neither would Elijah. Elijah was determined to ensure that Caldwell paid for what he had done, not just to Deborah, but to the entire community. His mind kept racing with strategies, thinking of ways to tie Caldwell to the conspiracy, but it was only when he received a call from Marcus that everything clicked. "We've got it," Marcus said, his voice full of urgency. "We hacked into the development files. Caldwell's been working with a shady group of contractors. He's paying them under the table to intimidate homeowners. We have proof he's been getting their cooperation in exchange for kickbacks. And we've traced a few payments back to Preston, Whitmore, and even some of the local judges. The connections are undeniable." Elijah's heart raced. This was it. They had the evidence they needed. Now it was time to make their move. "I'll meet you at the courthouse in 30 minutes, Elijah said, his voice tight with purpose. The courthouse was crowded with reporters when Elijah and his team arrived, the flashing cameras and murmurs of the crowd adding to the already tense atmosphere. The press had picked up on the arrest of Deborah Powell, and now they were hungry for any new developments. Elijah was used to the attention, but today it felt different. Today they were not just fighting for his mother's innocence. They were fighting to bring down the system that had been corrupted from the inside out. Elijah strode into the courthouse with confidence, his team behind him. They had come prepared. David had already filed a motion for a hearing, and Marcus had gathered every shred of evidence they could find. Now it was time for the world to see the truth. Inside the courthouse, the mood was even more charged. The district attorney, William Price, was already seated at the prosecution table, looking more uneasy than Elijah had ever seen him. Price had always been a slick politician, always one to dance around the truth when it suited him. But now, with all the evidence stacking up, he had nowhere to hide. Elijah moved to the front, his presence commanding attention. As he passed by, a few of the reporters raised their cameras, snapping pictures of the most decorated Green Beret in the country. But Elijah didn't care about the cameras. He cared about one thing: justice. He took his seat, facing Price and the opposing counsel. The judge, a woman named Patricia Lawson, took her place on the bench. She was known for being tough, no-nonsense, and fair, a perfect fit for the case at hand. "Let's get started," Judge Lawson said, her voice cutting through the noise. "This is an urgent matter. We've heard enough about this case already. Mr. Price, you may proceed." Price stood, visibly sweating under the pressure. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the state believes that the defendant, Mrs. Deborah Powell, has been involved in the theft of the Callaway diamond necklace. The charges have been substantiated by witness testimony, and we believe she poses a threat to public safety." Elijah's eyes narrowed. He had heard enough. He stood, his voice booming across the courtroom. "Objection, Your Honor. The charges against my mother are baseless, fabricated by a corrupt system designed to push her out of her own home. We have evidence proving that the so-called theft was orchestrated by Charles Caldwell and his associates, including local officials, to discredit my mother and force her to sell her property." The courtroom fell silent. Price's face paled as Elijah continued. "We have bank records, emails, and witness testimony proving that Caldwell paid off several people, including Officers Crow and Harris, and even Judge Whitmore, to manipulate the legal process and destroy my mother's reputation." Elijah's words were like a bombshell. The entire room was in shock. Price, now speechless, stood frozen, unable to respond. Outside the courtroom, the media was abuzz with the new developments. News outlets across the country were picking up the story, reporting on the corruption, the stolen land, and the battle for justice in Hampton Heights. For the first time, Deborah's story was no longer just about one woman. It was about a community's fight for survival. Elijah looked at his mother, who sat beside him, a calm smile on her face. She knew that this was just the beginning. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of the world lift off her shoulders. The truth was coming to light, and with it, the power to fight back. The battle had only just begun, but the wheels of justice were finally in motion. The courtroom was electric with anticipation. Deborah Powell sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her sharp eyes fixed on the proceedings. Elijah, standing by her side, was ready. His mind was clear, his focus unwavering. This wasn't just about his mother's reputation anymore. This was about justice for an entire community that had been oppressed for far too long. The evidence Elijah had presented earlier, bank records, emails, witness testimonies, had shaken the foundation of the case against his mother. But it wasn't enough. He knew that the battle wasn't won yet. Caldwell and his empire were powerful, and they would fight dirty. Elijah was prepared for that, though. He wasn't leaving until Caldwell was brought to justice. Judge Patricia Lawson, a no-nonsense woman known for her fairness and integrity, surveyed the courtroom with a commanding presence. She had heard enough of the lies, enough of the manipulation. It was time to move forward. "Mr. Price, it seems that your case has more holes than I was led to believe," Judge Lawson said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "You failed to provide any substantive evidence linking Mrs. Powell to the theft. In fact, it appears the charges were fabricated to cover up a much larger scheme. I'm giving you one more chance to make your case. But let's be clear, if you don't have anything substantial, I will dismiss these charges." Price, visibly sweating now, looked over to his colleagues. His confidence had been shattered. Caldwell had never expected things to escalate this far. He had thought that Deborah would buckle under the pressure, that the town's support would crumble in the face of media manipulation. But now, with the truth on the table, it was clear that Caldwell's empire was starting to fracture. Elijah turned to his team, David, Marcus, and the witnesses they had gathered. The people who had been silenced for years by fear and intimidation were now standing with him. One of them was Emma Wilson, the young gallery assistant who had been too terrified to speak out earlier, but now she was ready to testify. Emma had been one of Deborah's former students, and her connection to the case was crucial. She had seen Victor Preston, the gallery owner, slip the necklace into a safe when no one was looking. She had heard the whispered conversations about how to frame Deborah, and she was ready to tell the world the truth. When Emma took the stand, the entire room fell silent. She was shaking, but her voice was steady as she began to speak. "I was working at the gallery that night," Emma said, her eyes scanning the courtroom. "I saw Mr. Preston take the necklace. He put it in a safe in his office when everyone's attention was focused on the art. He told me later that it was a necessary business decision, and that if I wanted to keep my job and my scholarship, I needed to go along with the story." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Deborah's eyes locked with Elijah's. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Emma's testimony was the key they needed to bring everything into the light. Victor Preston, sitting in the gallery, looked like he had just been punched in the gut. His face turned pale, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. He had been the one to plant the evidence, the one who had manipulated the system to get Deborah arrested. But now the truth was coming out. he was trapped. "Mr. Preston," Judge Lawson said, her voice stern, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Preston opened his mouth, but no words came out. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He had been bribed by Caldwell to lie, to frame Deborah, to cover up Caldwell's real intentions. But it wasn't just Preston who was in trouble now. Elijah knew that it was time to take the fight to Caldwell himself. As Emma's testimony continued, the weight of the situation began to shift in their favor. Caldwell's plans were starting to unravel. The more that was revealed about his corrupt dealings, the less power he had. His empire, built on lies, was collapsing piece by piece. But Caldwell wasn't going to give up that easily. He was a man who had always believed he could buy his way out of anything. This time, though, his money wasn't enough. Back in the courthouse, Caldwell was pacing in his office, his mind racing. The situation was slipping out of his control. The media was turning against him, the public was starting to question his methods, and the evidence that had been uncovered was damning. He had thought he could use the town's media outlets to spin the narrative in his favor, but now the truth was becoming undeniable. He made a quick phone call to his lawyer. "Get me out of this," he snapped. "I'll pay whatever it takes. Just make sure she doesn't win this." His lawyer's voice was calm, but there was a clear note of panic. "Charles, it's not that simple. We're losing ground here. The feds are sniffing around, and I think there's a bigger investigation coming. If this goes public, we'll all be done for." Caldwell slammed his fist on the desk, his anger boiling over. "Then fix it. I don't care what it takes. I will not lose to this woman." Back at the courthouse, Elijah stood tall, his focus unwavering. He knew that this moment would define everything. As Emma finished her testimony, Elijah took his place in front of the courtroom, his eyes fixed on Caldwell's lawyers. "This is the moment of reckoning," Elijah said, his voice carrying through the room. "For too long, this town has been ruled by people like Charles Caldwell, people who think they can buy power, intimidate the weak, and erase history. But today, that ends. The truth is out. And Charles Caldwell will face the consequences of his actions, just as anyone else would." The tension in the room was palpable as Elijah spoke, his words laced with conviction. The community had been wrong for so long, but now the tide was turning. Deborah's fight for justice had sparked a movement, and it was gaining momentum. As the final arguments were made and the judge prepared to deliver her ruling, Elijah looked over at his mother. Her face was calm, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. They had been through so much, but they were on the verge of victory. Together, they had taken on an empire, and together they would see it fall. The courtroom waited in breathless anticipation as Judge Lawson stood to speak. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Every eye was trained on Judge Patricia Lawson as she prepared to make her decision. Deborah Powell sat still, her back straight, her eyes fixed ahead with quiet determination. Elijah stood beside her, his presence a silent promise of protection. They had come this far, and now the truth was on the verge of prevailing. It had been a long, exhausting battle, but it was all leading to this moment. Judge Lawson tapped her gavel, and the murmurs in the room fell into a hushed silence. She glanced at the lawyers on both sides, Elijah's team, led by David Wilson, and the opposition, the desperate Caldwell lawyers. Her gaze was sharp, assessing, knowing full well the significance of what was unfolding. "Having heard the testimony presented, and having reviewed the evidence provided, I am prepared to make my ruling," Judge Lawson began, her voice steady and authoritative. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. "The prosecution, led by Mr. Price, has failed to present any credible evidence linking Mrs. Deborah Powell to the theft of the Callaway diamond necklace. In fact, the testimony provided by the defense, including the courageous statement of Miss Emma Wilson, has proven that the charges were fabricated, part of a broader conspiracy orchestrated by Mr. Charles Caldwell and his associates." There was a collective gasp from the gallery. Elijah allowed himself a brief smile, but he remained focused, knowing this was just the beginning of a larger victory. "Furthermore," Judge Lawson continued, "the evidence provided by the defense has shown that Mr. Caldwell and several local officials, including Judge Whitmore and Officers Dawson and Harris, have been involved in a scheme to intimidate and force the residents of the Heritage District into selling their homes. This constitutes a clear abuse of power, and it will not be tolerated in this court. Deborah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she remained composed. She had known deep in her heart that the truth would emerge. Her fight had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. Judge Lawson turned to Price, who was now standing, his face pale. "Mr. Price," she said firmly, "you have had ample time to present your case, and yet the only thing you have succeeded in proving is that the charges against Mrs. Powell were not only unfounded, but part of a larger conspiracy designed to destroy her reputation and seize her property." Price swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure, but the damage had been done. He could feel the walls closing in on him. His ties to Caldwell, though subtle, had now been exposed, and his career, like Caldwell's empire, was crumbling. The judge's gaze shifted to the gallery, where Caldwell's lawyers were sitting, their faces ashen. It was clear that their clients' well-laid plans were now falling apart. "Charles Caldwell," she said, her voice sharp, "your actions have led to the wrongful arrest of an innocent woman, the destruction of lives, and the corruption of a system meant to serve the public. You have attempted to manipulate the judicial system for your own gain, and for that you will answer." Caldwell, who had been sitting quietly, his face contorted with rage and frustration, stood abruptly. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Judge Lawson," he spat, his voice trembling with fury. "I built this town. I own this town. I'll make sure you regret this." Judge Lawson's gaze didn't waver. "You will regret your actions, Mr. Caldwell, and you will face the full consequences of the law. I'm ordering a full investigation into your dealings and your influence over local officials, including Judge Whitmore, Officer Dawson, and Officer Harris." Caldwell's face drained of color as his world began to collapse. His empire, built on intimidation, corruption, and greed, was crumbling before his very eyes. There was no escape now. He had underestimated the power of truth, the strength of one woman's resolve, and the loyalty of her son. Turning to Deborah, Judge Lawson addressed her directly. "Mrs. Powell, you have shown extraordinary courage in the face of immense adversity. You have stood for justice, not just for yourself, but for your entire community. This court recognizes the injustice that has been done to you, and I hereby dismiss all charges against you." A swell of emotion rose in Deborah's chest. She had fought for this moment, for her name to be cleared, for the truth to be recognized. But this wasn't just about her. It was about the entire Heritage District, the community that had been threatened with erasure. This was a victory for all of them. "Furthermore," Judge Lawson continued, "I am issuing a formal request to the state's Attorney General to begin an immediate investigation into Mr. Caldwell's activities, his illegal dealings, and his attempts to force residents out of their homes. We will ensure that this town is rebuilt with respect for its history and its people, not as a playground for the wealthy." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the decision settling over everyone. Then, as if on cue, the gallery erupted into applause. Deborah Powell, standing tall, finally allowed herself a moment of relief. She turned to Elijah, her son, who stood beside her, a look of quiet pride in his eyes. "You did it, Mom," Elijah said softly, his voice filled with admiration. "You did it." Deborah smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. "No, Elijah, we did it. We couldn't have done it without you." The applause in the courtroom grew louder as Deborah and Elijah made their way to the exit. For the first time in years, Deborah felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. The legacy she had fought to protect, the history of the Heritage District, was safe. It had been a long and hard-fought battle, but she had won, and so had the people who had stood with her. As they walked out of the courthouse, Elijah's phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "The feds are moving in. Caldwell's going down." It was over, but the battle wasn't just for Deborah's home. It was for every family, every person who had been wronged, every voice that had been silenced. They had shown that one person's courage could indeed change the course of history. The courtroom had been buzzing with activity as the verdict was read, and the collapse of Caldwell's empire began. For Deborah Powell, it was a moment of vindication that felt as though it had been a lifetime in the making. She stood at the entrance of the courthouse, Elijah by her side, feeling the weight of the years of struggle finally lifted from her shoulders. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the city. But for the first time in weeks, Deborah allowed herself to breathe. "This is just the beginning, Mom," Elijah said, his eyes watching the crowd outside the courthouse. He was a soldier at heart, his mind always thinking ahead, preparing for what might come next. "We've won this battle, but there's still work to do. Caldwell's network is far-reaching. He won't go down without a fight." Deborah nodded, her face serene but resolute. "I know, son, but the people of this town are awake now. They've seen the truth. It's time for change." As they made their way through the crowd, which was growing louder with every step, Deborah felt a wave of gratitude and pride. People who had once been afraid to speak out, afraid of losing their homes, their livelihoods, were now standing together. Many of them were residents of the Heritage District, the very community that Caldwell had tried to erase. They had all witnessed the battle unfold, and now they were standing with Deborah, cheering her on. It wasn't just her victory anymore, it was theirs. "Miss Powell!" a voice called from behind. Deborah turned to see Emma Wilson, the young gallery assistant, hurrying toward her. Emma had been the crucial witness who had testified about Victor Preston's actions that night at the gallery, exposing the entire conspiracy. She had been terrified at first, but now there was a newfound strength in her step. "Miss Powell, I just wanted to say thank you," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I was scared of losing my job, my scholarship. But you taught me something important. You showed me that standing up for what's right is always worth it." Deborah smiled gently, placing a hand on Emma's shoulder. "You did the right thing, Emma, and you don't have to apologize. We all have our fears. What matters is that you found the courage to speak the truth when it counted." Emma's eyes glistened with tears as she nodded. "I'm proud to be part of this, Miss Powell. Your fight is our fight now." Deborah glanced at Elijah, who stood behind her with his usual calm demeanor. "The fight isn't over, Emma, but together we've made a real difference today. Don't ever forget that." As Emma walked away, Elijah placed a hand on his mother's back. "Let's go home, Mom. It's been a long day." They stepped into the waiting car, and as the vehicle pulled away from the courthouse, Deborah glanced out the window. The streets of Hampton Heights had always been familiar to her, quiet, lined with trees, a place where people knew one another. Now the streets seemed to hum with a new energy. A sense of hope had returned to the air, and Deborah could feel the winds of change beginning to stir. Back at the Powell household, the atmosphere was quieter. The evening had settled into a peaceful calm, the house filled with the warmth of family. Elijah had already begun working on the next steps, making calls and coordinating with the legal team. But for Deborah, there was a moment of stillness. She sat on the porch swing, a cup of tea in her hand, gazing out at the stars. "Your father would have been proud," she said softly, her words more to herself than to Elijah, who was sitting beside her. The night air was cool, and for the first time in a long time, Deborah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known she could experience again. "I know he would have been," Elijah replied, his voice thick with emotion. He had always admired his mother for her strength and resilience, but today he saw it in a new light. "You've always been the heart of this family, Mom, and now you've shown the whole town what it means to stand for justice." Deborah smiled, her eyes distant for a moment, as memories of Robert, her late husband, filled her thoughts. He had been the rock of their family, the one who had stood beside her through thick and thin. They had fought for their home, their community, and now it was time to see the fruits of that labor. "We've fought hard for this," Deborah said, her voice steady. "But we must keep fighting. There are still so many who have been silenced, so many who lost their homes because they couldn't stand up to people like Caldwell." Elijah turned to face her, his gaze intense. "We will fight for them too. You've shown them that they're not alone. They have the strength to stand up against injustice, just like you did." Meanwhile, in a sterile, windowless room on the top floor of a corporate building in the heart of the city, Charles Caldwell was fuming. The once dominant tycoon was now in damage control mode, surrounded by his legal team, his shoulders tense, his hands clenched into fists. He had spent years building his empire, manipulating the system, pushing out families, and now it was all falling apart. "Caldwell, we're doing everything we can," one of his lawyers said, his voice shaky. "But the evidence is mounting against you. The state attorney general is already involved, and federal investigations are opening up. The damage to your reputation is irreparable." Caldwell slammed his fist on the desk. "This isn't over. I'm not going down like this. I built this town, and I'll be damned if some woman and her son are going to destroy everything I've worked for." His lawyer sighed. "You need to prepare for the worst, Charles. The system is turning against you." Caldwell's eyes narrowed with defiance. "We'll see about that." The following days brought more surprises. The state attorney general, acting swiftly after Judge Lawson's decision, began investigating Caldwell's entire operation. The once unquestioned developer's ties to corrupt officials were unraveling faster than anyone had expected. One by one, Caldwell's allies began to distance themselves from him, their own careers on the line. The news spread quickly, and soon Caldwell was no longer the man who controlled the fate of Hampton Heights. Instead, he was a symbol of the greed and corruption that had plagued the community for far too long. And in the wake of it all, Deborah Powell stood tall, her legacy now forever tied to the preservation of the Heritage District and the community that had rallied behind her. The battle for justice had been long and difficult, but in the end, Deborah had shown everyone what it meant to fight for what's right. As the community of Hampton Heights gathered to rebuild, it was clear that they would do so with pride, unity, and the courage to stand up against those who would try to erase their history. In the days following the court's decision, Hampton Heights began to change. It wasn't just the victory in Deborah Powell's case that had ignited the spark. It was the awakening of an entire community that had long been silent in the face of corruption. The streets, once tense and divided, now felt filled with possibility. People who had once feared speaking out began to come forward, sharing their stories, their struggles, and their victories. Deborah Powell's fight was no longer just her own. It was the fight of the whole neighborhood. And though the victory had been hard-won, it was only the beginning of the transformation Hampton Heights would undergo in the months to come. Deborah sat on the porch of her home that evening, the cool night air wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. Elijah was beside her, his calm presence a steady anchor. The house, a symbol of their family's history, stood proudly in the heart of the Heritage District. It had been a long road, but they had survived. And now, with Caldwell's empire in ruins, the people of this town had reclaimed their future. "I never imagined this day would come, Elijah," Deborah said softly, her voice full of reflection. "I knew we were up against a powerful man, but I never thought it would stretch this far. Now the whole world knows what he did." Elijah looked at his mother with a smile of admiration. "You didn't back down, Mom, and you showed everyone that no matter how hard the fight, justice will always find a way." Deborah nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "I didn't do it alone. This community, they fought beside me. Emma, Marcus, David, they all played their part." Elijah leaned back, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the first signs of dawn were beginning to break. "We have a long road ahead. Caldwell isn't the only one who's been playing the system. We'll need to keep fighting. But this victory, it's a huge step. It gives people hope." Meanwhile, across town, Charles Caldwell was in a world of trouble. The weight of his empire had come crashing down faster than he could have imagined. After the verdict in the trial, he'd tried to spin the story in his favor, attempting to discredit Deborah, to paint her as a criminal. But his own allies were abandoning him. The press had turned on him, and the public outcry was deafening. Caldwell's lawyer had tried to reassure him at first, but even he knew it was too late. The federal investigation into his corrupt dealings was gaining momentum, and whispers of his illegal business practices were now seeping into every corner of Westwood County. Caldwell sat in his lavish office, staring at the reports in front of him. He had tried to buy out the whole town, forcing out the people who wouldn't sell their homes, manipulating local officials, and covering his tracks with money. But now it was all unraveling. The evidence against him was insurmountable. His connection to Judge Whitmore, Officers Dawson and Harris, and even some of the city's most prominent figures was now exposed. His phone buzzed, and the name that appeared on the screen made his heart drop. It was Victor Preston, the gallery owner who had been involved in framing Deborah for the theft of the necklace. "Preston," Caldwell answered gruffly. "Charles, we have a problem." Preston's voice crackled through the speaker. "The investigation has opened up, And I've been called in for questioning. They know about the payments, about everything. I think they're going to throw me under the bus." Caldwell's patience snapped. "You were supposed to keep things quiet, Preston. You were supposed to handle everything. Now look where we are. You're a liability." "I didn't know it would go this far, Charles. They're talking about indictments. They're looking at all the accounts we've used, your connections to the judges, to the police. This is bigger than we thought." Caldwell slammed the phone down, frustration boiling over. He had underestimated Deborah, underestimated the power of truth, and now it seemed like there was no way out. He could feel the walls closing in on him, and for the first time in his life, he didn't have a plan to escape. Back at Deborah's house, the community had gathered for a celebration. The house, once a symbol of resistance, now represented a new beginning for everyone. Neighbors, friends, former students, and even local activists had come together to honor Deborah and the victory she had secured, not just for herself, but for the entire neighborhood. Deborah stood at the center of the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces around her. She saw so many familiar faces, people she had taught, neighbors she had known for decades. And there was a sense of unity among them that hadn't been there before. The streets of Hampton Heights felt different now. The fear, the tension, the uncertainty, it had all been replaced with hope. "I never imagined this day would come," Deborah said, her voice carrying over the gathered crowd. "But it did. It wasn't just me who fought for this. It was all of us. We've stood together, and together we've won. And now, we rebuild." The crowd erupted into applause, and Deborah felt a surge of emotion. Her heart swelled with pride, not just for what she had accomplished, but for what the people of Hampton Heights had accomplished together. Elijah stood by her side, watching as the community celebrated. His heart swelled with pride for his mother. This fight had been personal for him, too. It had been about protecting everything his parents had worked for, the legacy of their community, the history that ran deep in their veins. But more than that, it had been about fighting for a future where people no longer had to live in fear. As the night wore on, Deborah and Elijah took a moment to step outside, away from the celebration. They stood in the yard looking at the stars above, reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. "Elijah," Deborah said softly, her voice full of gratitude, "this community isn't just made up of buildings and land. It's made up of the people. We fought to protect that." "I know, Mom," Elijah replied, his eyes shining with pride. "We've protected something far more important than just a piece of land. We've protected the heart of this community." The next morning, news reports began circulating about Caldwell's rapidly collapsing empire. Federal investigators had seized records from Caldwell Enterprises, and the details of his corruption were now being revealed to the public. His network of manipulation and intimidation had been exposed, and it was clear that the once powerful businessman's reign was coming to an end. Deborah and Elijah stood side by side, watching the news unfold. The weight of the battle had lifted, and now as they looked toward the future, they knew the fight for justice was far from over. But today they could finally rest knowing that they had won. The community of Hampton Heights had stood tall, and together they had faced down the forces of greed and corruption. And in the end, the truth had prevailed. The sun was rising over Hampton Heights, casting golden light on the streets that had witnessed so much pain, struggle, and triumph. The legacy of the neighborhood, which had been nearly erased by the greed of Charles Caldwell, was now firmly rooted in the hearts of the people who called it home. Deborah Powell stood at the edge of her porch, the quiet hum of the morning filling the air. It was peaceful now. The fight had taken its toll, but it had also created something stronger in its place. Deborah had never imagined that the battle for her home would grow into something so much bigger. The fight to preserve her family's legacy had turned into a fight to protect the entire community's history. The way the people of Hampton Heights had come together in the face of corruption had shown her the power of unity. And as she stood there feeling the warm sun on her skin, she knew they had won. Elijah walked up behind her, his presence a constant source of strength. His calm nature had been her anchor throughout the chaos. She turned to him, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "It's over, Elijah," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it. We really did it." Elijah smiled back, his eyes filled with pride. We did, Mom. The people have found their voice, and we've shown them what they're capable of. It wasn't just about us. It was about everyone in this town. Deborah nodded, her gaze wandering over the community she had fought to protect. In the wake of Caldwell's downfall, the Heritage District was beginning to thrive again. The families who had once been driven out were now returning. Businesses that had been stifled by Caldwell's influence were slowly being rebuilt. It was a small victory, but a powerful one. Hampton Heights was starting to feel like itself again, like a place where history mattered, where the strength of the community could not be bought or intimidated. The federal investigation into Caldwell's affairs had already led to multiple arrests. His connection to Judge Whitmore, the corrupt police officers, and even local politicians had been exposed. Caldwell was facing federal charges of racketeering, corruption, and witness intimidation. His empire was in ruins. He had lost everything: his money, his influence, his power. It was a bitter irony that Caldwell's greed had led to his downfall, while Deborah's steadfast determination had brought the truth to light. As news of his arrest spread, the town seemed to exhale collectively. The fear that had gripped Hampton Heights for so long was slowly starting to fade. As Elijah and Deborah made their way to the community center later that morning, they were met with cheers and applause. The town had organized a celebration, one that was long overdue. People from all walks of life, from different generations, were coming together to honor Deborah, the woman who had led them to victory. Elijah was proud of his mother, but he was also proud of the town that had come together in the face of adversity. "Mom, you've become a symbol for all of us," a neighbor, Marcus Taylor, said as he approached them. He was one of the first people to help gather the evidence that led to Caldwell's conviction. His work had been instrumental in taking down the entire network. "What you've done for this community, it's more than just about your house. It's about what you've taught us all." Deborah smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't do it alone. It's all of you, the people of Hampton Heights. We've shown the world that we can't be silenced, and we won't be." Marcus shook his head. "But it was your courage that started it all, Miss Powell. You didn't back down when everyone else would have. You stood for what was right, and you've made history because of it." The crowd around them cheered in agreement, their applause louder now. It wasn't just a celebration of Deborah's victory. It was a celebration of the community's resilience, its unwavering belief that justice could be achieved, no matter how impossible it seemed. Later that day, Elijah received a message from David Wilson, their legal advisor. It was a brief note, but its impact was profound. "We've secured a federal grant to begin restoring the Heritage District. The state has also agreed to help fund community programs to ensure that this kind of corruption never happens again." Elijah shared the news with his mother, and Deborah's heart swelled with pride. It was everything she had fought for. The district, the history, the people, everything was being preserved. Their fight hadn't just saved her home, it had saved an entire legacy. As Deborah sat down at her kitchen table later that evening, her thoughts wandered back to Robert, her late husband. He had always dreamed of seeing their neighborhood thrive, of ensuring that the history of the Heritage District was never forgotten. Now, with the work they had done, that dream was becoming a reality. Elijah came over to sit next to her. He placed a hand on hers and smiled. "Dad would have been proud of you, Mom." She nodded, her voice filled with quiet emotion. "I couldn't have done it without him, and I couldn't have done it without you." Elijah squeezed her hand. "We're in this together, always." In the months that followed, Hampton Heights continued to heal. Deborah Powell became a local hero, not just for her strength, but for the way she had inspired others to rise up against injustice. The people of the district were working together to restore the homes that had been neglected, to create a new future while honoring the past. The community center, where so many had once gathered in fear, now served as a place of empowerment. The battle for justice was never truly over, but for the first time in a long time, Deborah and Elijah knew that the fight they had started had paved the way for a brighter, more hopeful future for everyone in Hampton Heights. As Deborah stood on the porch that evening, looking out over the streets she had fought so hard to protect, she knew one thing for certain: the legacy of Hampton Heights would never be erased. It would live on stronger than ever because of the courage, the strength, and the determination of the people who called it home. Months later, as the community flourished once again, Deborah Powell found herself speaking at a local gathering for the first time since the victory. The crowd was larger than she expected, with families, teachers, and activists coming together to honor the hard-won peace. "We've come a long way," she began, her voice steady but powerful. "But this fight is not just about one person. It's about all of us. It's about the strength of a community, the belief that when we stand together, we can overcome any obstacle. The work we've done here will echo for generations. And that, my friends, is something no one can take from us." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time in a long time, Deborah felt like the legacy of her family, her community, and the district was finally safe.